"You're being incredibly unprofessional. Pack your things and get out." The words, delivered with the chilling finality of a tombstone being laid, echoed in the sterile expanse of the executive office. I didn't flinch, not outwardly. Inside, a cold, hard knot began to form, a knot that would tighten over the next few weeks until it became an unyielding fist. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a grieving son processing a sudden loss, but a spoiled child wielding a borrowed power with reckless abandon. His face, usually a mask of forced pleasantness when around his father, was now set in a grim, almost petulant line. The office itself felt suffocatingly small, the expensive mahogany desk suddenly a barrier, a throne from which he'd just deposed me. Outside, the city hummed, oblivious to the quiet demolition taking place within these four walls. My normalcy, my steady rhythm of deadlines met and projects nurtured, had just been obliterated by a single, callous sentence. It wasn't the first time I'd witnessed his casual cruelty, though it was the first time it was directed squarely at me. I remembered the company retreat 2 years ago. His father, my mentor, had been beaming, sharing anecdotes about his early days in business. His son, then a barely there presence in the company, had scoffed loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Honestly, Dad, were things that primitive back then? Like you actually built something from scratch?" "Pretty sure it was mostly luck and connections." The silence that followed was thick with disapproval, but his father, ever the indulgent parent, just chuckled, a strained sound. His son, meanwhile, had sauntered off to the bar, leaving his father to awkwardly smooth over the ripples. I'd felt a pang of sympathy for the old man then, seeing how his pride was so easily undercut. Then there was the incident with Sarah, the marketing intern. She'd accidentally forwarded an email chain with some slightly embarrassing office gossip to the wrong person, his father. Panic had ensued. While everyone else scrambled to contain the damage, his son had found it hilarious. He'd cornered Sarah by the coffee machine, not to offer comfort, but to whisper, "You know, if you'd just put in a little more effort, maybe you wouldn't be making rookie mistakes like this. Think about it. Daddy's watching." He hadn't been there to help her, he'd been there to bask in her distress, to remind her of her precarious position, all while subtly flexing his familial muscle. Sarah had cried in the break room for an hour, and I'd been the one to find her, to offer quiet words of reassurance, feeling the familiar exhaustion of being the adult in rooms where entitlement reigned. These were not isolated incidents. They were brushstrokes on a portrait of a young man who saw the world as his personal oyster, a world where rules bent and people deferred because of the name he carried. He expected deference, not earned respect. And I, having dedicated years to building my career, to proving my worth through hard work and integrity, found myself at the whim of someone who had never had to work for anything. The quiet endurance was becoming a strain, a constant low-grade hum of simmering resentment that I'd learned to keep buried deep, for the sake of my own peace and my loyalty to his father. The day he fired me, the air in the office was heavy with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the lingering ozone of an approaching storm. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, blurring the cityscape into abstract streaks of light and color. I had been called in ostensibly to discuss the Q3 projections, a meeting I'd prepared meticulously for, armed with spreadsheets and strategic insights. Instead, I found him perched on the edge of his father's imposing desk, a position he'd only dared to take when his father was out of town. He didn't offer me a chair. He didn't even look directly at me. His gaze was fixed on the rain-streaked glass, as if the drama of the downpour somehow mirrored his own perceived importance. "You're being incredibly unprofessional," he'd said, his voice carefully modulated, devoid of warmth. "Pack your things and get out." I stood there, a silence stretching between us, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. My mind raced, sifting through the last few months, the last few years. Had I missed something? A memo? A veiled warning? There had been no performance issues, no disciplinary actions, nothing to warrant this. My mind flashed back to the meeting where his father had introduced him as the future leader, a phrase that had always felt a little forced, a little desperate. I remembered the pride in the old man's eyes, a pride I now saw reflected in his son's smug, dismissive smirk. He finally turned to face me, his eyes, a pale imitation of his father's warmer hazel, held no trace of regret, only a cold, almost bored finality. It's just not working out. His father want. Essay change. A fresh perspective. You understand. Understand? I understood that this was a power play, a clumsy assertion of dominance by a boy playing dress-up in his father's suit. The entitlement radiated from him, a tangible force in the room. He was enjoying this, the power to disrupt, to unilaterally dismantle a career he had no hand in building. My hands, which had drafted contracts, negotiated deals, and guided projects to completion, felt suddenly useless, hanging by my sides. I saw the flicker of triumph in his eyes, the satisfaction of wielding authority, even borrowed authority, with such absolute, unearned ease. He expected me to crumble, to plead, to be grateful for whatever meager severance he might deign to offer. But as I stood there, feeling the icy grip of dismissal, something shifted within me. The years of quiet endurance, the swallowed insults, the overlooked contributions, they coalesced into a singular, cold resolve. This wasn't about anger anymore, it was about something far more precise. I looked at him, at the arrogant set of his jaw, the way he fiddled with a Mont-Blanc pen as if contemplating the best way to sign my professional death warrant. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the storm brewing within me, but mine was a controlled storm, a hurricane waiting for its moment. I understand, I said, my voice even, betraying none of the turmoil. I met his gaze, holding it for a beat longer than he expected, and saw the faintest flicker of surprise, the first crack in his facade. He had expected meekness, not defiance. However, before I pack my things, I believe there are a few outstanding matters that need to be formally addressed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply reached into my briefcase, the worn leather of familiar comfort, and pulled out a thick, manila envelope. It was a document I'd prepared months ago, a contingency plan, a personal insurance policy drafted with the same meticulous attention to detail I applied to every business deal. It was a comprehensive compilation of agreements, contracts, and communications pertaining to my role as a consultant, a role that, unbeknownst to him, had a specific, ironclad termination clause. A clause that stipulated a significant severance package, a substantial bonus payout, and the immediate transfer of intellectual property rights for projects I had personally spearheaded, should my contract be terminated without cause. I laid the envelope on the corner of his father's desk, carefully positioning it so it wouldn't disturb the pristine chaos he'd created. His eyes, no longer looking out at the rain, were now fixed on the envelope, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He picked it up, his fingers fumbling slightly. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first page, then widening. He flipped through the pages, his smugness evaporating like mist in the sun. The carefully constructed arrogance began to crumble, replaced by a dawning horror. He looked up at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly ajar. What is this?" he stammered, his voice losing its authoritative edge, replaced by a desperate, reedy tone. "It's a summary of our contractual obligations, should this relationship, as you've so eloquently put it, not be working out," I explained, my tone still calm, almost conversational. "The severance package, as you can see, is outlined on page 3. The IP transfer agreements for the Horizon Project and the Alpha Initiative are on pages 7 and 9, respectively. All of this was clearly stipulated in our initial agreement, and subsequently reaffirmed in our contract addendum dated." I paused, letting the silence hang, letting the weight of his own arrogance settle upon him. 18 months ago. He was silent, his eyes darting back and forth between the document and my face. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking almost translucent against the dark wood of the desk. The initial shock was giving way to a raw, unadulterated panic. He hadn't even bothered to read the termination clause of his own father's most trusted consultant. He had assumed his word was law, his whim sufficient justification. But this will cost, this is a fortune," he finally choked out, his voice cracking. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Indeed. And it's all legally binding." His father was very thorough when it came to protecting his assets and the people who helped build them. I let that sink in, the implied loyalty, the implicit understanding that I was not just an employee, but a trusted partner, a relationship his son had so carelessly disregarded. He slumped back in his chair, the expensive leather groaning under his sudden weight. The pen slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the desk, a small sound in the overwhelming silence. He looked utterly defeated, his borrowed power evaporating in an instant. He had imagined himself a king, making pronouncements from his fat hers throne, and now he was just a boy, trapped by the very rules he'd assumed didn't apply to him. The rain continued to fall, washing away the city grime, but it couldn't wash away the look of utter desolation on his face. I saw the immense loss in his eyes, not just financial, but the shattering of his ego, the brutal confrontation with his own incompetence. The aftermath was a flurry of frantic, unanswered calls. His father, away on a business trip to Asia, was unreachable. His mother, a woman whose indulgence of her son was legendary, was predictably apoplectic, bombarding my phone with texts that ranged from confused pleas to thinly veiled threats. They quickly devolved into passive-aggressive inquiries about my personal vendetta, as if my adherence to a legally binding contract was some sort of personal affront. The flying monkeys, as I'd come to think of them, were relentless. His younger sister, whom he'd always lorded his perceived superiority over, called me once, her voice laced with a mixture of schadenfreude and genuine concern for her brother's immediate, and now very public, financial embarrassment. His father eventually returned, his face etched with a weary disappointment that spoke volumes. I never received an apology from him, nor did I expect one. He understood the nature of the contract, understood that I had acted within my rights, and perhaps, on some level, appreciated the quiet, decisive justice of it all. His son, however, was a different story. The severance package was astronomical, a significant dent in the company's coffers. The loss of the IP rights to the Horizon project, a venture I had personally conceptualized and brought to fruition, was particularly painful. It was the crown jewel of my work there, the very thing his father had intended to groom him for, and now it belonged to me. The company's stock, already facing a downturn, dipped further as news of the substantial payout and IP transfer began to circulate. Whispers turned into speculation, and speculation into a quiet erosion of confidence. His son, stripped of his ill-gotten authority and facing the tangible consequences of his impulsive decision, was a man adrift. The social circles that had once fawned over him now seemed to distance themselves, sensing his diminished status. He was no longer the heir apparent, he was the prodigal son who had squandered a fortune with a single, ill-considered act. The shame was palpable, a heavy cloak he couldn't shed. He retreated, his brief reign of perceived power replaced by a quiet, mortifying exile. I never looked back. My life didn't suddenly transform into a fairy tale of riches, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing his world implode, of knowing that my meticulous planning had undone his reckless entitlement, was a profound kind of justice. There was no triumph in shouting, no glory in confrontation. It was in the cold, precise execution of a plan, in the quiet knowledge that the system, when properly understood and utilized, could indeed deliver a powerful, and often devastating, consequence. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed world. And in that quiet aftermath, there was a deep, unwavering sense of peace, a chilling testament to the power of a measured response, and the far-reaching implications of underestimating a person's resolve. His loss was absolute, a self-inflicted wound that had bled him dry, all because he'd mistaken a borrowed title for true power.